I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
Don't ever say to her that her
What about the Chautauqua Institute?
Introductory discussion on the ethical
We left.
for a community.
China took back over.
Currently doing in autism.
Freedom rider and civil rights activist Bob Zellner was the son and grandson of Klansmen. He became the first white Southerner to serve as field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, better known as SNCC. The organization played a central role in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Zellner's 2008 memoir, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, a white Southerner in the freedom movement, has been described as a story that is sometimes horrific, always interesting, and ultimately inspirational. We'll talk with him about his experiences in the civil rights movement, including being jailed with Martin Luther King Jr., and about the civil rights issues he's still fighting for today. Here's our conversation with Bob Zellner. Bob Zellner, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Patty. Glad to be here.
Your personal story starts about as far as one can get from where it ended up. Explain how a descendant of Klansmen ended up becoming one of the first white Southerners involved in the civil rights movement.
Well, thank you for asking. I grew up in L.A. in Lower Alabama, and my dad was in the Klan, my grandfather was in the Klan. I was very lucky that my father did leave the Ku Klux Klan, and when he did, his father disowned him, and his brothers never spoke to him again in his life. So very early on, as a small child, I was not totally aware of that struggle, but I benefited from the journey that my father took, from being a Klansman, graduate of Bob Jones College. My mother and father were both graduates of Bob Jones College, and now Bob Jones University.
And you were named after Bob Jones.
I'm named after Bob Jones. He's my godfather, and I think I was a big disappointment to him because I was supposed to be. Actually, I come from a long line of fundamentalist terrorists, when you think of it. And for me to get involved in the civil rights movement was very unusual. But starting out in South Alabama, I had to do something about it.
Before we find out what it was that sparked your interest in racial issues, tell us a little bit about going to Europe with Bob Jones, and the sea change in his thinking about race.
Well, this is part of the family history, and we are our own memoirs. We are our own story, and a lot of it is where we come from and who we come from. And my father was a Methodist minister. My mother was a school teacher, and I had 4 brothers. And my father, going to a fundamentalist college, growing up as a son of a Klansman and a Klan organizer, he was actually an organizer in Birmingham, Alabama. He went to Europe in the middle of the 30s, before the war, with Bob Jones, to convert the Jews to be Christians, to save them from his own Nazi ideological brothers. And his experiences there, I asked him if he converted any Jews, and he said no, but they converted me. So his experiences there changed him from being a Klansman, and when he quit the Klan, he began to work with Joe Lowry and Reverend Dr. King in the movement. And he was a Southern churchman who spent his whole career trying to undo segregation inside the Methodist Church.
You tell this story, and it is a page-turner in your 2008 memoir, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, a white Southerner in the freedom movement. You really, it took you almost 50 years to write that book, and I'm wondering what prompted you to finally tell your story?
What prompted me to tell the story finally is, number one, I got some help from Connie Curry, who had done a lot of books on the movement. She helped me in editing that. But it was really going back to James Foreman, who was the executive director of SNCC, one of the great figures of the civil rights movement, totally unknown now. And Foreman said to all of us in SNCC, make a record, write it down, tell the story. And he knew the importance. He wrote a book called The Making of Black Revolutionaries.
In fact, he interviewed you when you first became a member of SNCC because he was not too sure, is Bob Zellner a spy, or is he really, really interested in improving race relations?
Yes, when I came to work with SNCC in the fall of 1961, Jim Foreman was the first person that really vetted me. And he put a big Wallensack recorder, taped a reel-to-reel recorder, and he stuck a mic and he said, "I want to know why a white cat like you wants to join a black outfit like this." And I started out telling the story. He said, "Your daddy was in the what? In the Ku Klux Klan, your granddaddy what?" So that's the way we started out. And he said, "Well, your story better check out, brother, because if it does, we need you in the movement." But that was the attitude, because very few white Southerners went to the front lines. There were lots of moderates and lots of liberals, but very few white Southerners really became an integral part of the struggle in the movement.
In fact, when you spoke out on college campus at Huntington College in Alabama, where you went to school, and raised some opposition to the fact that a young black woman wanted to attend the University of Alabama, and this was making a stink, people looked at you like, "What are you saying?" and that you were a traitor to your race. Well,
when authoring Lucy was the first black student at the University of Alabama, I would say I think that's good for Alabama. It's good for the University of Alabama. And people say, "Don't let anybody hear you say that." Just the least bit of dissent or disagreement from the mainstream would get you in trouble, and they say, "Well, people will hurt you if you say that." And so that was the way. See, that's the way this conformity has been enforced. In Germany, the people who joined the Jews and fought against Hitler, they were terribly persecuted. The communists, the Catholics, the Gypsies, and all of the people who opposed that regime, they were hunted down like animals. And the very same thing happened in SNCC. The first few months of my work with SNCC, 5 of my colleagues were murdered. They were lynched.
And you have served time in jail at least 20 times in 7 or 8 states. How difficult was it for you to get a white attorney in the South to represent you? And what kinds of charges did they levy against you?
Well, the charges were pretty ridiculous because actually the charge was tending to free yourself and to free others. But they came up with everything. The incredible thing was that in my state of Alabama, which was a police state under George Wallace and John Patterson, George Wallace appointed a Klansman to be head of the highway patrol. So it would be like the Texas Rangers joining with the outlaws, you know. So when we grew up and we started struggling in the South, the police were on the side of the Klan.
They were the Klan.
They were the Klan. It was basically the same. And we were betrayed time and time again by the FBI, for instance. The FBI was against the movement. J. Edgar Hoover hated King. He instituted the COINTEL program, which was spying on movement people. And if you're spending all that amount of time spying on Martin Luther King and Bob Zellner, what's happening to the real criminals? They're robbing banks or something.
In fact, the Attorney General of Alabama called you to his office to say that you were falling under the influence of the communists and that you better stop what you were doing.
Oh yes, after 5 of us from my sociology class went to hear Dr. King speak and meet John Lewis and others in SNCC, the church was surrounded, and Dr. King said we were going to be arrested. But we managed to escape. We got back to campus, and our college president said to the 5 of us, "You have to resign from school," because we had gone to an integrated meeting. The Klan burnt crosses around our dormitory. We were called into the office of the Attorney General, and he said, "You're under the communist influence." And we said, "There's communists in Alabama?" But yes, that was the idea, that if you opposed segregation or supported women's rights or wanted to organize a union or something, you were under alien influence. You were supposed to toe the super conservative line.
Tell us something that you write about. It's a page turner and really, really hard to read, and that is your first experience marching. And we're talking about Macomb, Mississippi.
Oh, yes. Well, it is a little difficult to talk about, but I do talk about it a lot in college campuses and Martin Luther King days, first towns and cities, because I try to bring those young people to actually what it was like when you had to actually write your will to do this kind of work.
As a 19-year-old.
As a 19-year-old, yes. And, and to just register people to vote. We were only doing the most basic democratic things. It was at the same time we were in conflict in the Cold War against godless communism. But in democracy, U.S., you could get a bus burned because you wanted to ride together on the bus. So my first meeting of SNCC was in Macomb, Mississippi. Herbert Lee had been murdered because he was working with Bob Moses, and a black Mississippian had gone down to register to vote, and he was murdered by his next door neighbor, E.H. Hearst, who was a member of the Mississippi State Legislature. And then one of the witnesses...
Shot in the head.
Shot in the head at the Cotton Gin in Liberty, Mississippi. And the black witnesses were forced on pain of death to testify that Herbert Lee had attacked with a tyrant. Lewis Allen witnessed the murder, told the Justice Department about it, and said he wanted to testify that it was cold-blooded murder, that there was no tyrant, Herbert Lee did not attack E.H. Hearst. And he was later murdered in his own, going through the gate to his house.
And so it's in this atmosphere that you go to Macomb, Mississippi to march as the only white person among black members of SNCC.
Yes, the 130 students from the Berglund High School marched out of school to protest the murder of Herbert Lee and the expulsion of Brenda Travis, who was a 14-year-old high school student. So I was my first SNCC meeting, and I said, how can I be in SNCC without joining? But to make a very long story short...
It wasn't your first SNCC meeting, it was your first SNCC march.
My first SNCC march, absolutely. But we went, and as we were marching down to the town hall, a mob formed of 400 or 500 people, and we were blocked. And the students stood up and prayed on the steps, and the police would arrest them one at a time. And a little group started hitting me, and a little group of Klansmen. And Bob Moses and Chuck McDew, both black staff members of SNCC, came to stand between me. That was the nonviolent way. If somebody is being attacked, you go and take some of the punishment. You don't fight back. But the police came over and banged them in the head, bursted their heads, and blood all over the place, dragged them off. And the little group, the big group out in the street said, bring him here, we'll kill him. And they picked me up and were carrying me into the street, and I took hold of the rail down the City Hall steps. I didn't know much about nonviolence, but I had been a martial arts instructor when I was in college. I was in good shape, so I just held on. And when they pulled, I would hold on, and when they came back for another pull, I would move up the rail. They were so frustrated, 12 or 14 grown men, they couldn't pull me loose from this rail to kill me out in the street. One man came over the back of my head with his fingers and started trying to get a hold of my eyeball. And he would work my eyeball out of the socket, practically, and try to get it between his thumb and forefingers. And I would move at the last minute, and my eyeball would thunk back into my socket. And I just thought that this is, well, I had all kinds of irrelevant thoughts. And number one, I thought that eyeball is a very tough little muscle. You think of the eyeball as being like a grape, you could just mash it, or styrofoam, but it's a very strong muscle. And finally, they just piled on top of me, knocked me loose from the rail, and the last thing I remember is my head sticking out of the pile being kicked by a boot. And I said to myself before I lost consciousness, this is the way that I die. So I was almost killed in my first demonstration, and after that, I was not afraid of anything. It was all lagniappe, as they say in Louisiana. It's all extra, and I have some higher power that's watching over me.
I read first-person accounts of a number of people who were involved in the movement, everyone from John Lewis's account to Jim Zwerg and yours, and one of the things that impressed me so much was the commitment was so strong that when you were looking death in the face, a certain calmness seemed to come over you that allowed you to carry on.
Yes. Well, Patty, you know, we made the decision that we wouldn't be doing that if longevity was the main thing, that we wanted to live. We didn't want to commit, we didn't want to be martyrs, but the first Freedom Rides came to Montgomery when I was still a student, and I organized some students to go down there to the bus station.
To help.
To help, to try to, at least, we didn't know much about nonviolence, but at least we would try to keep somebody from being killed. But by the time we got there, the Freedom Riders had been brutally attacked.
The bus had been torched.
The bus was burned, the people were beaten, cameras were laying in the street, blood was covering the street. And I went to St. Jude's Hospital in Montgomery, to where Jim Zwerg and some of the Freedom Riders were, and I said to Jim Zwerg, "Your Freedom Ride is over." And he said, "Oh no, as soon as we're able to get back on the bus, we will." And the man couldn't walk, he couldn't see. And I said, "Jim, if they treat you like that in Alabama, they're going to kill you when you get to Mississippi." And everybody thought they would die when they got to Mississippi. He said, "We know, we've written our wills." So that was how strong it was.
And Jim Zwerg, a white northerner, was disowned by his family. He thought he was out doing what he was taught in his Christian family.
Yes, yes, yes. From Minnesota, I think, or Wisconsin. I'm not absolutely
Wisconsin.
sure. Wisconsin, yes. And was a tremendous example to all of us, because sometimes the white students were singled out for brutal treatment. But because you were considered a race traitor. Yes, which actually was a left-handed compliment to the young black men and black women who were making the movement, because they were saying, well, they have an issue. They have a right to revolt, but you're privileged. Why would you revolt? So they actually realized that it was something to revolt against, but we're not supposed to help the black people. Well, I didn't go to help the black people. I was not free. I fought for my own freedom and the freedom of everyone. The interesting thing is that Jim Zwerg felt a tremendous amount of guilt that his story made the news. It made newspapers worldwide that this white northerner was almost killed in the struggle for racial justice. And he thought, why am I, of all the people out there, getting this attention when so many blacks are so dying? Is that a dilemma that you ever struggled with? It happened over and over again. By 1964, numerous people, black people, had been killed in the movement. Herbert Lee, Lewis Allen, and when the 3 civil rights workers, 2 white New Yorkers and a black Mississippian, when they were killed, it was worldwide news. James Chaney, Andy Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner. And that was galling to a lot of people. But everything has 2 aspects. One of the reasons that they asked college students to come from all over the country in 1964, 50 years ago this year, was that they're not going to care. The American public won't care unless it's congressman's son and lawyer's son and doctor's sons and daughters from all over who are putting their lives on the line. And then it became an issue. And that turned out to be the case. Yes. You say that today we are refighting some of the civil rights victories that you had 50 years ago. Voting rights, for example, is one example. Yes, Pat. As a historian, I know that after the Civil War, nobody ever thought we'd go back to an all-white ballot box in the South. And by the end of the 1800s, by the end of the century, it was back to an all-white ballot box. After the Civil Rights Movement, nobody thought that women's rights would ever be challenged again, that voting rights would ever be challenged again. And of course they are every day. They are being challenged every day, and the right wing now is, now I don't say Republicans, but the right wing, they're asking John Lewis to walk backwards over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. In 1965, next year, 50 years. The Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act. After that bloody confrontation on the bridge, they're asking him to walk backwards across that bridge now and to have a voter ID okay, to have all of these voter restrictions that they're now putting on in my state of North Carolina, for instance, to have them okayed. And the movement we can't lose John Lewis's legacy or the legacy of SNCC or all the other civil rights movements. You actually spent time in a jail cell with Martin Luther King in Albany, Georgia. What was that like? Well, you know, it was an amazing thing to know Dr. King and Mrs. Rosa Parks, when they were ordinary human beings, but of great courage and great organizing skills. Dr. King always took an interest in younger people. And I was very pleased to be on the Freedom Ride in 1961. I was in jail with Dr. King in Albany, Georgia. And they often talk about Albany as being a great failure, but it was a huge success for the movement. It mobilized a whole community and a whole state, the same way the Montgomery bus boycott had mobilized in Montgomery. So Dr. King was, he's a wonderful person to be in touch with, and we can still be in touch with him through those people who knew him and those people who followed him. So millions of people follow him around the world now. And you know, in terms of education about the civil rights movement, people around the world know a lot more about Dr. King than our students do.
Wow. That must be very upsetting to you.
Well, it is. We need to be able to see Black history not as just this month, it's Black History Month, but as American history. And it's right in the center of American history. Has always been and will be until we solve this racial problem.
You and 4 of your classmates went to talk with Martin Luther King as part of a sociology class assignment on race relations. You ended up attending workshops that Martin Luther King attended and that Mrs. Rosa Parks attended. At one point, you write in your book that she touched your elbow and said, "Bob, it's not enough." Tell us the story. It's not enough just to study this. You need to do something.
Yeah.
What impact did that have?
Well, it had a tremendous impact because 5 white students had gone from Huntington over to Reverend Abernathy's church to hear Dr. King and meet John Lewis and the others who made the lunch counter sit-ins, the beginning of the youth phase of the civil rights movement. And the church was surrounded, and the police told Dr. King they were going to arrest the 5 of us white students. And he devised a plan that he would go out the front, and at least we could try to get away, and Reverend Abernathy and Mrs. Parks could take us down to the basement. And when he went around the front, if the police and news people ran around there, we could try to escape. And sure enough, we were able to escape. But while we were waiting for Dr. King to go out the front door, Mrs. Parks, who was a great organizer and not just a tired seamstress, she was an activist with the NAACP. And she touched me on this elbow, which I haven't washed since then, by the way. And she said, "Bob, when you see something wrong, you have to do something about it. You have to take action." So that was my introduction, really, to the activist phase of the movement. And I always took that to heart, what Mrs. Parks said. We can feel whatever we want to feel. It's the actions that we take. You have to take action.
I don't know if it's the same elbow, but one chapter in your book is titled Up South, because this battle really is, it happened to you in New York when you were trying to work with the Shinnecock Indians in New York in a dispute over a development going in over an ancestral burial ground. Yeah. And the police there manhandled you, broke your elbow.
Yeah, they broke this elbow. Rosa Parks blessed this elbow, and the police broke this one. So, yes, that was at a time when I had been working with the American Indian movement, with the activists in the movement, since actually 1972, when I went to China with a group of Americans. But there was a situation in Southampton, New York, in the Hamptons, the richest place in the United States, where they were encroaching further on the reservation, which was once 3,500 acres and is down to 800 acres. And they were bulldozing the graveyard, the cemetery. And the activists from the Shinnecocks came out and blocked the bulldozers. And I was head of the anti-bias task force while I was teaching at Long Island University in Southampton. And they asked me to come and mediate. But just the act of coming to mediate between the state police and the nation, the Indian nation, they saw me as being on their side. And I was 62 years old, and they beat me, arrested me, broke this elbow, knocked my jaw out of place, and injured my left knee. And I spent the night in jail. That was not in South Alabama. That was in Southampton, New York. You
helped to change the civil rights movement, and I'm wondering How did the civil rights movement change you?
The civil rights movement changed me in that it gave me a life cause. Once my dad quit the Ku Klux Klan, he became a minister of the social gospel. He worked with Joe Lowry in SCLC, he worked with Dr. King, he worked with the progressive church people all across the South to integrate the Southern Church. They haven't done a great job of it, but the Methodist Church is a much better place for that struggle. And the way it changed me was that it gave me a way of living out the gospel of Jesus when he said, go to the catacombs, take a risk. You know, the early Christians had to draw a fish in the dust to see who else might be a Christian in the group. That was on pain of death that you would be a Christian. So I knew that to be a real Christian, you had to take a risk and you had to confront the issues of the time, and segregation was that issue. And if I had to put my life on the line, I could do it with thousands of other young people.
Bob Zellner, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Patty.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Bob Zellner. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also find an excerpt from Zellner's book, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek. I'm Patty Satalia. We hope you'll join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.